playing sounds. So the delta of audio, what is the delta of audio? What is it important? I did a presentation on this a while back, and it basically centers around trying to create big differences in the audio in your game. So whatever you're doing, whether it be sound effects or music or environmental stuff, try to maximize the change. And this is important because if you can attach it to gameplay, then it's going to further your gameplay. That's the short version of what the delta of audio is. Okay, so the role of audio. Ultimately, audio is basically there to support gameplay, and gameplay is king. Sometimes we support the visuals, but ultimately it's the gameplay drives audio, and audio tries to drive the gameplay. Anything we do, whether it's sound effects or music or ambiences, you always look at gameplay first, and then you attach the audio that's necessary. So in any game, there's that you see, or movie, or film, or short story, there's a pulse. In this particular diagram, we look at the game pulse, and you can see kind of how it's moving up or down, and then you have your climax at the end with your boss fight. All games are slightly different, but ultimately you have these kind of ramps that go up and down, and that sort of pushes the player and pulls and creates tension and other things. So the sound design ultimately seeks to make a direct correlation between that game pulse and also to provide useful feedback. In this game here, which is a thief game, basically you can see there's a whole bunch of different paths that you can take that all create a different pulse. And ultimately what you want to do with music is you want to try to sort of match that as best as you can. Not all games necessarily need a direct fit between the music and the gameplay, but it usually helps and it usually propels your gameplay. Some of the games that I've played that I was thinking about this that were really obvious were Dead Space. Anybody played Dead Space? Yes? Yeah. Another game, Super Mario, 1986. You may remember that the music in there very much matches the levels. And that's, a long time ago, and even then, it was pretty obvious that correlating your music to your gameplay was important. The terminology, basically in musical terms, drones are typically pieces of music that have no harmonic movement or no rhythmic content. And so, as a result, they can create a lot of tension when you put them into a game or into a film or something. So that's something that we're going to come back to a bit later. So a typical music usage in some of the games that I've worked on are you have your front-end music, you have your in-game music, maybe you have a pause menu, you have music there, or you don't, maybe you have end credits. And then in the in-game music is where we talk about the gameplay, and that's sort of what we're trying to drive at now. So some games have a constant music, so you get your song, you run it, you loop it, you play it, that's it, it does what it does. Other games have selective music or no music, so you have typical games where there's no music, and then you have music when there's tension, so it alerts the user to, okay, we got to do something here, something changed. Or you can have adaptive and selective music, where the music basically changes to suit the gameplay. And there's a couple of ways that we can do that. I've got an example here, which is a very simple way to apply this, where you have a track, and you do two mixes of it. So you have a low-intensity mix and a high-intensity mix. So in the game, the code controls which of those mixes it plays, and because it's one file, as you see here, it's a pretty seamless transition. So you can see you go from section 1, which is low intensity, to 2, which is high intensity, and then back and forth, and it all kind of happens in the background. And depending on how you've scripted it, you can actually follow the gameplay and create those moments that you need. So we've talked about game pulse. Here's something that could be a game pulse for a small game. You start high, you've got some dialogue, maybe your intro, and then you kind of ramp up to your climax. I've taken a piece of music and grabbed the pulse from it, and you can see what it does as it's moving through the different sections, through verses, choruses, pre-choruses, solos, the end goes down. So what happens when we put the two together? There's lots of things that can happen. Sometimes it can work, depending on how you mix the music. Sometimes it doesn't work so well. Sometimes what you get is a total non-correlation. So your gameplay is telling you one thing, and your audio, which is your music that you've thrown in, tells you another thing, and you get this. Not all games will give you this, but there's enough games that when you throw it in there, you'll pretty much kind of confuse the user. Sometimes it might be passable and you won't notice, but sometimes it won't be. And that's what we want to sort of move away from and move towards a better correlation. Basically, music as a drone, because music has its own delta, as we saw before, if you have highly dramatic music, it'll have a large delta. So think about classical music, and if you throw it into gameplay, it'll be pretty jarring when it goes from low to high, unless it's correlated with your gameplay. You can have a repetitive loop-based music, which won't have the big deltas, and it might work, but it's probably going to mask your gameplay a little bit, and the end result you're going to get is kind of like a drone of audio. Maybe some of your sound effects will come up and down and kind of highlight gameplay, but you can have this steady music. Or you can turn it down, but then you won't really have the emotional impact that the music is supposed to drive. So you may end up diminishing gameplay if you put the wrong music and the music doesn't correlate with the gameplay. Again, it depends on the game. I'm working on a game right now where we're not doing the interactive music because it tends to work and it's very quiet. So you can get away with it sometimes, but it's just good to know that if you do correlate it, you'll probably have stronger gameplay in the end. So what do we want to accomplish? We want to have adaptive music that will pace with the gameplay. We want to correlate as much of the music as we can with the gameplay to strengthen the gameplay. And basically, if we can also add dynamic mixing, which pushes and pulls the music around gameplay, it'll even be stronger for the gameplay. So I think that's all I have. How are we doing for time?
We're good.
We're good? Do I have time to go into some more stuff? Or?
Sure.
Okay, so as an example, one of the games that I'm working on right now, I was gonna talk a bit about how we implemented the music for that. So it's a space game. You're rolling around collecting things. So what we did for that is we created front end music, and to contrast the in-game music for this particular game, we created a really light fragments of music in the beginning. So there's music, and then there's 25-second gaps, and there's a little bit of music, little synthy stuff, and then there's gaps. So it really just sets the mood for something really light. As soon as you go into the game, we've got 2 levels of intensity, like I showed before, and we basically drive it up and down. And there's some situations where you're in a really tight, confined quarters, and you have to solve puzzles. So we use the low-intensity music to focus your attention on the task at hand rather than be distracting. And then when you get out of those scenarios, we bring the high-level intensity music. There's a bonus stage which has an orchestral score, which is epic, which basically is different from the rest of the game and kind of alerts you to a tension that doesn't exist anywhere else in the game. And there's also a parallel universe, which is really dark and kind of moody, and we've got some pretty scary, eerie, creepy stuff. So all along from beginning to end, there's different pieces of music that drive the delta differently. And then within the gameplay, we have the 2 levels that basically drive it even further. So that's it. Thank you very much.